All right, we can take America for God by giving the ministry to laymen who are using their gifts to grow their groups to double their classes every 2 years or less. The passion of my life is helping groups to double every 2 years or less, and it may not sound like much, but I guarantee if you can perfect the skill of doubling a class every 2 years or less, you couldn't build buildings fast enough, you couldn't start new services fast enough, you couldn't launch new churches fast enough to contain the growth that would result if we can perfect the skill of doubling a class every 2 years or less. And in this very first session, I'd like for us to begin by talking about our hearts. We're going to get into some very practical realities in time, but I want to begin by talking about our hearts. And I want to start with a question, and that question is, what do you think about when you have like nothing else to think about? Now, I know some of you are thinking, I always have something else to think about, but there's got to be sometimes when you're stuck in traffic. We found ourselves stuck in traffic a little bit today in the Austin traffic, and maybe you're stuck in traffic a little bit from time to time, and when you're stuck in traffic and you have nothing else to think about, where does your mind kind of naturally drift toward? Or maybe you're waiting in a doctor's office, or you're traveling somewhere. I probably think about this more often than most. This was a typical day in the office to me. I started out this morning at 6 a.m. on the East Coast in South Carolina. Spent about 10 hours traveling today, and that's kind of a typical day in the office for me. And if you live that kind of lifestyle, you have a lot of time that's kind of downtime along the way that your mind will kind of drift as you're dozing off to sleep on an airplane or something like that. Oftentimes when I travel, I think of myself naturally drifting toward thinking about maybe a famous church somewhere. I'm here this weekend. I'm going to be in San Antonio speaking Sunday afternoon. And so Sunday morning I have off, and I'm thinking, Max Lucado. I want to go hear Max Lucado Sunday morning is what I'm thinking about. And when I'm traveling somewhere, oftentimes I'll think about, is there a famous church? A few weeks ago, I was in First Baptist Church, Jacksonville, Florida, and that was kind of a treat to go there on a Wednesday night. A couple years ago, I was in New York City on a Sunday afternoon to see the men's final of the U.S. Open tennis tournament. Just happened to work out my schedule to be there on that night, on that afternoon. And so it's Sunday. Let me give you a little test here. It's Sunday morning, and you have nothing else to do, and you'd like to go to church somewhere in New York City. Now, I saw y'all have got a poster. Y'all sponsoring some church. So not counting that church, where would you think about going in New York City? Can you think of any place? Brooklyn Tabernacle, that's right. That's where I went. In fact, if you have the opportunity ever to go to Brooklyn Tabernacle, I would strongly advise you to do it. And just from among other things, did my heart good to see hundreds of people lined up for an hour or two before the services. Just like I noticed they were here when I visited in your church a few months ago. Hundreds of people lined up to come to those services there in downtown Brooklyn. And I had heard that was the case. And so I showed up myself about an hour early and stood next to this gal in line. She asked me about my day, and I asked her about hers a little bit. I told her I was going to the men's final of the U.S. Open tennis tournament. I said, what are you going to be doing today? She said, I'm going to be going to all 3 services here in Brooklyn. Now, these services are about 2 hours long. And unlike many churches, I'm not sure about y'all's church, but many churches like my church, we have an early morning kind of blended service, and then we have a middle 9:30. We call it Rock the Flock 930. It's pretty much youth camp on Sunday morning. It's hard driving rock and roll designed to reach teenagers at 9:30, and then 11 o'clock we have kind of a classic traditional service. And so if you stuck around for all 3 services at my church, at least you'd get some variety. You'd hear 3 different musical sets, although you'd hear the same sermon 3 times, but not at Brooklyn. They do the same sermon and the same music over and over, and they're each about 2 hours long. And so if you go to all 3 services there at Brooklyn, it's going to be taking you a long time. And so I asked her, I said, why are you going to all 3 services? And she said, what else do I have to do besides just hang out at God's house all day long? Of course, carnal soul that I am, I thought, well, the men's final of the U.S. Open tennis tournament is on for one thing. And, this is New York City after all. The truth is there's a lot of fun things you could do, but that's what she wanted to do. Another time I was speaking up in Milwaukee, and I spoke on Friday night and Saturday morning. I had Saturday night off, and I'm from New Mexico, so that's kind of the other part of the world to me. But I asked him when I said, how far are we here in Milwaukee down to Chicago, to Willow Creek? And as it turns out, it's only about an hour down there. So got arranged the transportation. We went down there to the Saturday night service. service at Willow Creek, one of the nation's largest and most influential churches. They had just finished up their small group conference, and John Ortberg, then one of their preaching pastors, had spoken. The title of his message was Huts of Refuge. Now, that title didn't particularly get my attention, but I like John Ortberg, and the tapes or the CDs are cheap there if you buy them in the bookstore. So I bought that and a number of other CDs, and it was one of those messages that has just rocked my world. You probably would agree with me when I say that most of the messages that you hear in your life on a good day will provide a kind of spiritual nourishment for today. In other words, it's sort of like a meal spiritually for the day. But there's been a few sermons you've listened to in your life, and it's been true of mine as well, that you would say just change the trajectory of your life based on that message. And this was one of those messages for me. I've listened to it over and over. I'm going to guess I've listened to it 30 or 40 or 50 times. I listened to it so many times. At one point, I was still intrigued by what John Ortberg had to say here, but I was also getting just a little bit bored. And I remember one time I was taking apart a waterbed and listening to the message, and I heard it so many times I wanted to just kind of, throw a little spice in there. So I hit that button on the CD player to make the message play in random order. I don't know if you've ever heard a sermon in random order, but, kind of a little variety in your life to listen to the conclusion first and then the middle part and then the beginning and this part over here and like that. And it kind of rocked my world. And January of this year, I was listening to this message again, and I felt like the Lord was saying to me, I want you to sing that song. I want you to preach that message. I feel like, any message worth preaching is worth stealing. And this one's kind of worth stealing right here. And I can't blame everything I'm going to say on John Ortberg, but I do want to give a little bit of credit where credit is due right up front, because many of the ideas from this first session especially will come from this message, Huts of Refuge. And John Ortberg starts with this question that we just described a moment ago. What do you think about? In idle moments, when you have nothing else to think about, when you're waiting at a doctor's office or you're stuck in traffic, what do you find yourself thinking about? You think about certain stereotypes of people. You think about a businessman, and he's constantly thinking about income and expense statements, and he's thinking about marketing strategies and operational cost and so forth. And that's how a businessman thinks. And you think about a coach, and he's constantly thinking about how to get the ball down the field or in the hoop or in the cup or whatever the sport might be. You go to lunch with that coach, and he's constantly scribbling X's and O's on the back of that napkin. You go out with a mom, let's say a 22-year-old mom, and maybe grandma comes to mom at some point and says, I remember how difficult it was being a mom. So let's do this. Why don't you take off for the weekend? You can run down to Houston or up to Dallas, run up to Las Vegas or Orlando if you want to. I don't care. Just take the weekend off, and I'll watch little Sean for the weekend. And you and hubby, you just have a good time for the weekend. And no matter where you send her, no matter how distracted she is, no matter how well taken care of that child is, if you were to follow her around in Orlando or Las Vegas or Atlantic City or wherever she is, you would find that she's constantly getting out that cell phone and looking for the display that might say, missed call, because she is a mom. And no matter how distracted she is, no matter how well taken care of that baby is, she is constantly thinking about that child. Now, this next question, it's an important issue in a way, because the Bible says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. And what you think about in those kind of idle moments really is kind of a picture of who you are. Now, this next question is a series of questions we're going to do tonight, and this next one is a bit of a stretch, kind of a theological problem in a way, but just work with me here for a second. What do you think God thinks about in idle moments? Now, I know some of you, many of you are Sunday school teachers, and so you realize right away there's a problem with this question, because we know that God is omniscient and He can think about everything all the time. I'm humble enough as a speaker to know that some of you are going to be tracking with me part of the time, hopefully much of the time, but I'm humble enough to realize that you're not going to be tracking with me all the time. You're thinking about some football game that you missed tonight, or you're thinking about, what you're going to eat when you go out afterwards, or you're thinking about a wide variety of things, but your mind will kind of flit in and flit out and track with me for a while and go off to something else. But no matter where your mind goes, God can go there too. He can follow your train of thought, and He can think about what all of you are thinking about all the time, and not only here in this room, but He can think about what everybody on the planet is thinking about, and He can think all those thoughts simultaneously, and not only what they're thinking about right now, but He can think about every thought that everybody will ever think, and He can keep all of those thoughts straight at the same time. That's kind of an amazing thing. But we get some insight into this question, what do you think God thinks about in His idle moments. I mean that somewhat tongue-in-cheek. And a couple of parables, actually 3 parables that Jesus taught. The first one went like this. He said, suppose one of you has 100 sheep and he loses one of them. What does he do? Does he just say, oh, well, got 99 others, no worries, let's go on with life? No. What he does is he leaves the 99 and he goes after that one sheep. And he goes after the lost sheep until he finds it. Now, when we hear that word lost in church, we tend to think of kind of a theological category. We think of a religious word, if you will. But I believe when Jesus used that word lost, it was not a theological category to him. It was not a religious word. It just was an ordinary word for him. And I want you to think for a second about what that word connotates for us when we think about something that is lost. This week, for example, I had on a pair of slacks, and I wore them one evening, threw them on a motel bed, and then bundled them up and threw them in a suitcase. And when I got up the next day, I put on my jeans, and I looked around the hotel room and found my wallet was lost. Now, as it turns out, my wallet was in that pair of pants that I'd worn the night before. I think about another time that I was vacationing on the West Coast, and I pulled out my wallet to pay for a gift as we left Universal Studios, and I bought some gifts there, and then went across town, half an hour or so across town to a restaurant, and paid for or ate the meal, and they brought the check, and I pulled out my wallet to pay for the meal, and I noticed that the credit card that I'd used to pay for the gifts at Universal Studios was lost. Now, if you had stopped me in that moment, if you had been enjoying supper with me, we'd been enjoying supper together that night, you would have found me to be a little bit focused. You would have found me to be just almost obsessed. And if you had said to me, don't worry about it. You're on vacation. You need to just relax. These fine, honest California people, I'm sure there will be no abuse. Why don't you just go on about your vacation, and when you get home, you'll probably find that there is an envelope sitting in your mailbox when you get home. And these fine California people, there'll be no abuse, etc. You would have found me to be kind of focused. I would have said, don't tell me not to worry about it. We're going to worry about this, and we're going to worry about this right now. I mean, we're going to get on the cell phone, and we're going to look up the number for this credit card company, and we're going to have them look up the number for our credit card, and we're going to find out already if there's been some abuse. If there is, we're going to try to get those things canceled. And then if there's not, or in either case, we're going to get this credit card shut down, and we're going to take care of this right here, right now, before dessert comes. And you would have found me to be kind of focused, kind of obsessed about that which was lost. And when we use that word lost in normal, ordinary language, it conjures up a certain feeling that we have when we have something that is lost. And Jesus told us not one parable, not 2 parables, but 3 back-to-back parables to tell us something about the heart of God, that it's kind of like we are when something is lost. He came back and he told a second parable. He says, suppose you have a woman that she has 10 silver coins, and you said to her, don't worry about it. Well, she would say, yes, sir, we're going to worry about this, we're going to worry about it, and we're going to worry about it right now. We're going to tear apart the place. We're going to look behind cushions and underneath beds, and we're going to keep looking until we find it. Because when something is lost, you get kind of obsessed about that which was lost. I know when I was growing up, I was constantly getting lost. Here's a picture of me when I was about a year old. And you can see that I'm on a little leash there, and that might seem a little cruel in a way to you. But my parents felt like, it was a more benevolent thing than allowing me to wander off somewhere. And I was constantly wandering off. I was the last of 4 kids, and my parents had a lot to keep up with. I was born overseas on the mission field in the Philippines. I'd been around the world a time and a half by the time I was a year and a half years old. And that kind of lifestyle, and given my tendency to kind of wander off, they felt like the more gracious thing was to put this leash on me. I remember another time, the next furlough actually, I was 5 or 6 years old. We were living up in Fort Worth at the time, and there was a time my parents had gone over to Town East Mall, and shopping's not very good in the Philippines, so they'd gone over there to the mall to do some first-class American shopping. I don't think that's the largest mall in the Metroplex anymore, but at the time it was. But even by today's standards, a pretty big mall. The 2 or 3 story thing, big awning in the middle, looks like a huge tent, and there's a big old huge courtyard and an eating area in the middle, and then outside of that huge area, there are spokes that go out, a huge mall. And my dad was watching me. You can be sure that'd be true, because this would never happen to a mom. But my dad was watching me, and suddenly he looked around, and I was lost. And he took a bigger circle and went into a few adjacent stores, and he couldn't find me anywhere. And after a while, he had to come clean with my mom and tell her that he had lost me. And so they called the security guards and did what they could, and they eventually did found me. I guess that's kind of obvious, but they did eventually find me. I was actually asleep on one of the little benches there in the mall. My point is this: if you had stopped my mom somewhere along the line when they were looking for me and said, "Don't worry about it. You got 3 other kids. Worst case scenario, you can make more." You would have found my mom to be a little bit obsessed. You would have found her to be a little bit focused. She would have said, "Don't you tell me not to worry about this. We're going to worry about this, and we're going to worry about this right now. We're going to stop everything we're doing. We're calling the security guards. We'll call the police if we have to, and we're going to get focused. We're going to set down our shopping, and we're going to get focused on just doing this one thing, because when something is lost, it makes us kind of obsessed." And Jesus told us a third parable about this one, a more personal parable, about a boy that came to his dad, and he said, "Dad, I know you'll leave me and you will, but I don't want to wait that long, so let's make a deal. You sell off your stocks and bonds and mutual funds and write me a check, and I'll write you a contract, really a contract to my brother, that says at the time of your death, everything else goes to my brother." Well, unbelievably, the dad did it. And he wrote the kid a check. The kid runs off to Las Vegas, Nevada. He spends it on wine, women, song, gambling, seafood buffets, and Celine Dion tickets. And at any rate, after a while, he runs out of money, and he comes to his senses, and he starts heading home. And the text says, while he was still a long way off, his father saw him. Now, what does that tell you about what that dad had been doing over the last several years? Had he just gone on with life and forgotten about it? No, because when something is lost, especially a child is lost, we get kind of obsessed. One other time I got lost when I was growing up, by the way. We were on an airplane one time, and once again, 4 little kids and a lot of hustle and bustle and packages and stuff. We got out to the airplane. My mom turns to my dad and she says, "How many kids you got back there?" And I'm not sure what the answer was, but the answer did not total 4. And so, she called the flight attendant and said, "Hey, man, we got to get back. We got a kid that's inside the airport. It's like a 4-year-old kid inside the airport. We got to get back." And they said, the plane had already left the gate. It was out on the tarmac ready to take off. And they said, "Ma'am, we're really sorry, but we got a schedule to keep, and we got things, we're not turning around." Well, you just got to know my mom. They did turn around. She spoke truth to them, and on the basis of her speaking truth, that she persuaded him that they did need to turn around. And it reminds us again that when something is lost, we get kind of obsessed about that which was lost. And here is the point. This is the point that I want to get to in this first segment. It is impossible for us to come to love God without sharing His heart for those who are far from Him. And because it is kind of our main point, I want to ask you to say it with me. Would you read this together off the slide? Let's say it together. It is impossible for us to love the Father without sharing His heart for those who are far from Him. And what John Ortberg pointed out to me, I found true of me. And as I have been traveling in church after church, about 100 churches and associations a year, I find it's true of many churches and many people in North America, that many of us think that we're growing spiritually because we attend church and because we read the Bible and we sing the songs and we learn the Bible verses, and for all these reasons we think that we're growing spiritually, but our heart is not growing more and more like the heart of God, who's kind of obsessed about those who are far from Him. And I want to suggest to you, friend, that I don't think we really are growing spiritually unless our heart is getting more and more like the heart of the Father that is kind of obsessed about people who are far from God.